Hey friends, welcome back to the Holy Ourselves podcast, where we explore faith and sexuality and gender and what it looks like to be whole in this crazy world. I'm really excited as we're starting out with season 2 to be talking to someone who I have known for a while. We've been in similar circles, but actually have never I think we were just talking about it. I think this is our first time actually speaking. So here with Dr. Mark Yarhouse. Dr. Yarhouse, I'm so honored that you would take the time to talk with me.
Oh, thanks, Josh. I've been looking forward to connecting with you. So, yeah.
Yeah, for anyone who's new to your work, which I mean, y'all, if you are new to your work, you really need to check it out. There's a lot there, but Dr. Yarhouse has just come out with a book with also Dr. Julie Sadusky, who, if you've listened to Life on Site B with me or multiple other things, have gotten to speak with her. The two of them came out with this new book, Emerging Sexual Identities, which is also connected to previous book, Emerging Gender Identities. Is that correct?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
It's kind of a companion book in some ways. Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
cool. That's what I was wondering, and that was going to be part of my question. But can you give maybe a little bit of an introduction to you and also what this book, about the book as well?
Yeah. So I am a professor of psychology at Wheaton College. So my primary responsibilities there is I teach in a doctoral program in clinical psychology,
Okay.
and I direct the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute, which is a institute. It's a center of the college that's dedicated to the study of sexual and gender identity. So how people are navigating like same-sex sexuality or diverse experiences of their gender, and in particular, the intersection of that with their religious identity, which is
Mhm.
for many of the people that we serve would be Christians, but not exclusively. So it's kind of that space. And we do have an outward-facing clinic, so I do provide clinical services, usually gender evaluations in recent years to understand if their person's experiencing gender dysphoria or if there may be something else going on, or just recommendations for families that maybe have felt strained navigating some of those spaces. So that's kind of my main thing that I do, and do some research and writing on the side as well.
Okay, sweet. Well, uh, we're going to really dive into this book, but and like you said, it's kind of an accompanying to your Merging Gender Identities book, and I found it really, really just such an intriguing read. But I guess maybe you could share a little bit about how maybe it connects to your work, like maybe what prompted you and Dr. Sadesky to write it, and who you had in mind for it.
Yeah, so it does help to kind of go back a couple years to
Okay.
emerging gender identities, because that was really, we were just seeing younger and younger people using different language than maybe the dominant language of transgender. And a lot of what emerging gender identities falls under is the non-binary umbrella, which is an experience of gender outside the binary of man or woman,
Hmm.
boy or girl. And so transgender usually means like a person's adopting a cross-gender identity, or they experience a cross-gender identity. And so non-binary is sort of in between that, or outside of the binary. And so we wrote a book to kind of capture that a little bit and try to understand um, how language is functioning for people around gender. And then we fast forward a couple of years, and we knew that that was also occurring around sexual identity labels. In between the two books, the Trevor Project would come out with a report of young people using over 100 gender identities, which very much mapped onto that book, and then
Yeah.
over 100 sexual identities, which very much maps onto this book. And so we report on that in this book, saying, okay, how does what we observed around gender identity apply to sexual identity? And at that point, I was reading some other people in this space. Rob Cover, for example, is someone that uses the language of micro-minoritized identities, which we can talk about a little bit later. But just
Yeah,
this
which was the
idea of
first time I've
more,
ever heard of actually that term, which I
yeah,
was like,
right,
oh, it's rare I
exactly.
come across a new term in this realm. And you
Yeah.
did it.
So that's this kind of granular use of both sexual and gender identity to describe a person's experience. And so that was really, and then just also kind of locating that in societal kind of cultural movements, um, where language used to be almost more like either Victorian or medical,
Yeah.
psychiatric, and it becomes something else that's more identity forward. And, kind of how we trace that was really fascinating to me, how language is changing and how younger people are approaching it, and in a sense curating it in online spaces in particular the younger you get. So all of that is kind of part of this book, how queer theory fits in, just really trying to kind of track where we are. A lot of people ask us, how are new, words and language and terms coming about. We're trying to kind of get a better sense of that. Of course, other people just kind of are very dismissive of it. I think we're just more curious about it. Like, okay, how is this? How is this functioning for people? So that's kind of where the
Yeah.
book jumps
That
in.
kind of leads into another question that I had, and I've wondered how your experience has been publishing these books, because especially as you said, I feel like in the Christian world we can often see these things and be very dismissive of it. So the moment that you get curious, even just from a research standpoint, the whole idea of like, are you promoting or are you against or all of that? How have you guys balanced when you've been doing this work of differentiating between simply like, we're just trying to get curious, like we're just trying to understand, versus like offering some kind of guidance or moralization? Or how have you guys balanced that, like both in this work, but also just like in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think both Julie and I, maybe because we're both clinical psychologists, is
Yeah.
that we're pretty comfortable describing phenomena, like what is out there, what
Hmm.
is happening, and that is the benefit of research. And so when you
Yeah.
survey people, hundreds of people, or you interview several people, you can sort of describe. And clinical practice is meeting someone one on one and describing, like what are they telling us is their experience. So I think we're both pretty naturally curious, and we both
Yeah.
are very comfortable describing. And then both of us have a heart for the church, and so we're both in ministry settings as well. When I'm not functioning as a psychologist, I've led home groups, and I've been part of ministries. I consult with a lot of churches. Um, so so having that desire to like walk with people in that space, because I'll minister to people outside of being a psychologist, and just people in past home groups and things like that, or equipping youth leaders, middle school youth leaders, high school youth leaders, college youth, like I love doing that. And I think helping them not shy away from these conversations, giving
Yeah.
them some reference points so that they don't feel as anxious stepping into the relationships that are around them. I think that's kind of a part of the motivation for both of us as well.
I love it. Yeah. Well, first of all, in a kind of joking way, but also I think this will kind of move us into the next point. I thought it was really interesting, the literally the first sentence of your book. You talk about how all of these emerging sexual identities, and then it said in place of older terms like gay. I remember sitting down after the first sentence, and I'm like, is gay an old term? I had to sit with
What
it for a
happened?
minute.
Yeah, right.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I just turned 35. And I was like, wow, all right,
Yeah, I hate to be
here
the
we
one to
are.
break it to you, Josh, but yeah.
Yeah, it's an old term. So, in light of the old terms of gay, um, can you give us just a general understanding when we're, especially within sexuality? Because I think you did point to it with emerging identities within gender. It really encompasses this non-binary, gender queer space, this kind of realm where, and that's the hard part sometimes I feel like in culture of you hear trans and then you automatically think, and which means someone who's transitioning, is transferring to across the binary. But when we're talking within sexuality, what kind of identities are fit into this emerging identities realm?
Yeah, so a lot of it is going to probably be located in the A spectrum, so asexuality, which is a spectrum. So
Yeah.
you'll hear language like demisexual or gray sexual. So people whose sexuality, they might experience maybe a more muted sexuality in terms of attraction patterns, or maybe under certain circumstances or a certain type of relationship and having emotional needs met in a certain way. So
Yeah.
you'll have kind of variations on the ace spectrum. So things like demisexual, gray sexual, of course, asexual, aromantic, demiromantic. So the romantic and sexual elements can all be a part of that conversation, but pansexual, omnisexual. So there's just, again, the Trevor Project reports over 100 different
Yes.
sexual identities. So, and they're drawing on, what in our book we refer to as emerging language, emerging terminology. And, you know as well as I do that many churches struggle just with language that's identity first, like gay or lesbian or bi. And so part of our concern was, man, we know a lot of churches that struggle with that language, let alone new terminology and the combination of terminology that is coming. And we wanted to sort of get ahead of that and help people realize, okay, hang on. I know, the original terms are not super comfortable for you, but there's more terminology coming, and we don't want you to kind of freak out or roll your eyes or just feel like this is just should be dismissed out of hand. We really want you to be engaged in ministry. That was kind of our focus.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because that's even something I engage with within spiritual direction. 98% of my directees are LGBT, same-sex attracted, somewhere within that realm. And I'm always intrigued about identity, because this avenue of dismissiveness, which this is something I'd love for us to talk about today, because I've been processing it, which is why I was thankful for this book, and even how you guys processed and talked about the history of identity. Because kind of the dismissiveness that you talk about, that kind of already creates this gap with gay and bi and lesbian. It creates it where then there's no place for queer people to process that, and like some of the different realms and things that go through that I'm sure you engage with as well when walking with people in counseling. But it's like, wow, the gap's just going to get bigger. It's just getting ginormously bigger. So within this realm, you used Raymond Williams' categories of residual, dominant, and emerging identities. So residual kind of being like homosexual, these kind of more terms that just are not used. The dominant ones, gay, lesbian, bi, and then these emerging identities. One question I had is, and obviously feel free to share anything more about those categories that you feel I missed, but as you were describing them, it almost felt like they were connecting to just like the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern kind of ways of seeing the world. Does that feel like connected to you in your research? Does that not feel as like clean cut?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a great question, and I hadn't really made the connection, so it didn't feel as like intuitively obvious to me. But as I thought about it, I was like, well, maybe that maps on in some really important ways. So I'd love to continue to let that to kind of wrestle with that. I think that's a really interesting potential, point of connection for people kind of thinking through this. I will say that like the residual is language like you described, like homosexual is kind of fallen out of the vernacular. Now, this isn't, don't think like in your local church where you might be saying, oh, we use that word all the time. I'm talking about the broader society in which we live. So don't think like, hey, in my local evangelical community, we use these terms. Okay, fair enough. But look at the broader culture and the language that's accessible and used, like even like in the American Psychological Association style guide, right? The APA style guide for writers. You're not to use the word homosexual. You're supposed to use the word gay, to use as essentially synonymous with homosexual, because the word has fallen out of the vernacular, because it's usually associated with more psychiatric and medical language and connotations and stigma. And so that's all what is Raymond Williams referred to as residual. It still has influence in a culture, but it's residue of a what had previously been dominant. So think kind of late Victorian, early 20th century, medical, psychiatric understanding of same-sex orientation and attraction had a little bit more of that. So sin in religious circles, abomination, the medical psychiatrics. This is before the diagnostic manual in psychiatry removes homosexuality officially, which would have been the 1970s. So that's a long time that that language was dominant. But now it's viewed as residual. So it's still influential, particularly in some more conventionally religious circles and some older psychiatric, medical circles, but it's not dominant today. And I think most people would agree with that.
Yeah, totally. That's a really good distinction, because you may still, I hear it whenever I'm working with Christians, homosexuality, and I'm always trying to help them understand, like within our context, it's not a helpful term. It's just, it can be very general. It can be and you're not going to hear that if you go out on the street, if you go into conversations, it's just not going to be there. So that's like where the residual aspect comes in, like you're speaking to.
It'd be pretty jarring actually for many people today if you're trying to use it in a ministry setting or something like that. So that's residual. So dominant is gay, lesbian, bisexual. So in the gender conversation, transgender, non-binary. So these are like the kind of primary ways people designate their non-normative sexualities, is to say I'm gay or even I'm queer. Like I'm, just to be able to use language like that is pretty widely used, probably widely accepted. You can see it. So it's not just like personal preferences for people, although it is that. It's also like in style guides and how people are supposed to be writing and sort of conveying. So it's sort of shapes and reflects cultural norms for today, talking about these issues. Now, gay used to be a derogatory statement, so did queer. It's been self-ascriptive in a way that the community said, we're going to take what you meant as harm and we're going to use it for good in this way. And so that alone is fascinating, but that's really been the dominant terminology of that community. And then you can move into emerging, which is more, the more, I call it granular or more micro-minoritized was the word that Rob Cover used, and just a little bit more detailed, as though young people were saying, I can't find myself. I can't see myself in the dominant language that's around. I'm indebted to it. I value the dominant language, but I use it as a springboard to share with others my experience. And my experience is a little more detailed in the ways that these words give me more precision. And I think that's how I would look at that language.
Yeah, I really appreciated when you were making the like you and Dr. Sadusky were making the distinctions between kind of how orientation is so foundational for the dominant identities, gay and bisexual and straight, like these understandings of this is just like a orientation. This is just something rooted. It's rooted in kind of like scientific language and these things. And then part of the emerging identities, as you said, since it's so rooted in, it encompasses a lot of asexuality and pansexuality and some of these kinds of things that it might even blend over between the LGBT community and elsewhere. Like I even had one time that I had a friend and she's straight and she was explaining about how her attractions work, and I'm like, it sounds like you're demisexual. And she's like, can I be that if I'm not like gay? And I'm like, it's just about how you're, And I remember for her, that was a process. This was just like a friend we were talking. I was like, as she was explaining some of the things, that this becomes kind of a much more less categorical and more individual kind of experience.
Right.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, and I think people do wonder, does that make me part of the LGBTQ community? Does it? Because what we were seeing is that in the asexual community, there's a higher percentage of people for whom the gender piece is also in play, as well as the sexual piece. So that micro-minoritized drawing on both sides. So like an aromantic demigirl, so kind of a muted experience around romance, but also a sense that as being a woman or being a girl feels a little bit the dial's turned down a little bit in that way. And so here's a person drawing on that. And so they might identify with the LGBTQ community for either one of their sexuality or their gender. You know what I mean? So I think
Yes.
for some people, it's kind of opened the door of possible identification with in ways that's a bit more expansive than it was just under dominant terms. So I think that's a possibility because we are seeing a rise in national studies of younger people identifying as anything other than heterosexual is often the way it's phrased. And so, okay, there's a lot actually under that, what's not heterosexual? Well, there's a lot of terms that would be fitting in there. And I think a lot of people who are asexual identify more with the gay community than they do the straight community because they're still non-normative, in a way that's important in this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so this kind of leads me into an area of like a question that I've been processing, and I was like, this felt like a good place to see because you guys talked about the history of sexual identity, development, and how there's this. I'm going to read a quote from part of it. It was like page 12, where it says, "This led to the shift." So you were talking about like the kind of leading from the religious dominant understanding to the more psychological, and said like this shift, this led to a shift from vice as a category, as a religious category and a meaning-making terminology, to abnormality, psychiatric category and meaning-making terminology for homosexuality in particular. Whereas heterosexuality could be increasingly thought of as automatically virtuous and normative in society more broadly. Once we shift from thinking of sexuality in terms of acts to identities, anything a man and a woman do together sexually is naturally cast as natural. And what it was making me think of is how a lot of times in this faith and sexuality conversation that happens is a lot of much more conservative critics of identity kind of processes for LGBT people will point to the reality that sexual identity is a construct. Like, you're like, this is a social construct. This hasn't always existed. We don't need it. And that's part of the argument to say your identity should be in Christ. You shouldn't be using all of these identities. And that ultimately, in my experience with working with LGBT people, is there's often, especially if there's been a really heightened hiding period in the closet, there can be a really extreme identification process, trying to understand their experience, like you're saying. Like, a lot of this is youth going, hey, this language doesn't really connect to my experience. And so it feels like the criticism coming from their church is saying, you need to hide your experience. That's like what is being received in it. But the reality is it's still a construct. And also I've noticed how as LGBT people and youth can come out and verbalize and talk about their experiences, there's almost like waves of experiences where it's like the identification is really important in one way, and then maybe that doesn't become as important later on, and it kind of goes through these realms, which kind of lends to the construct of it. I guess part of one of my questions is how do you engage with the tension between the constructed pieces of the history versus the real experience when it comes to sexual identity in this?
Yeah, that's a fascinating area, and it's so we cite a philosopher who passed away just a couple of years ago. His name's Ian Hacking. He's was a Canadian philosopher, and he kind of walks this line between what's referred to as realism and nominalism. And so I'm not a professional philosopher. I'm just a psychologist, But from what I read in Hacking, I think what he's arguing is, so if you're a realist, you believe that these categories have always existed. They're ontological realities, meaning they truly exist on their own, and they're just waiting for us to discover them. And if you're more of a nominalist, you believe that society, as language changes, creates new people. And so there's radical forms of both of those on the extremes that are very strong adherents to those positions. And what he lands on is, he calls it dynamic nominalism. And I tend to land on that as well, or I found it to be more compelling, that there's elements of of social processes in play. I mean, young people only have access to the linguistic constructs that are
Yeah.
available to them. And so as
Yeah.
they're in this adolescence, emerging adulthood, this time of identity formation, and that goes back to developmental psychology, Eric Erickson. It's a very normal experience for every adolescent to sort of go through a
Hmm.
time of identity exploration and formation, hoping to land at synthesis. So
Yeah.
take away sexual attractions, orientation, every adolescent is going through a process of identity formation. So we want to recognize that that's done in a cultural setting, a societal setting, with whatever language is available to them. So there will be cultural elements to that. But we
Hmm.
also believe that there probably are from nature, whether it's biologically derived or how we conceptualize that. There are real categories, and um, in some ways there's elements of both in play, and then I think it's been easier to see that with dominant language like gay and lesbian, because those have been studied more from a scientific and previously a medical psychiatric
Yeah.
understanding. And it was deeply important to the gay community to be seen as the equivalent of a heterosexual orientation, which almost never gets studied. Like, how do people come to identify as straight, and how does a heterosexual orientation, is it nature, is it nurture? Like, those questions
Hmm.
never get asked. But
Yeah.
I think to the gay community, it was really important for the argument for rights, like
Hmm.
gay marriage and
Yes.
people's views about being gay. We know from social psychology are deeply influenced by whether you believe it's biological or a choice
Hmm.
or some other avenue to get there.
Yeah.
And so that was the argument of it being innate and it being
Yeah.
immutable. And that comes out of that dominant way of thinking about um, sexuality as gay, straight, bi. Like, that's kind of where that language reflects that emphasis. And so in emergent language, there really isn't that same indebtedness. I mean, they're indebted to the dominant path. They're very
Hmm.
grateful for it. But they're not needing psychiatry to say it's no longer a mental illness the way the gay community benefited from that
Yes.
in the 1970s. Like, they needed that
Hmm.
to assimilate into the broader culture and say, we're on par with everybody else. Whereas, if you're 16 today, that's not your point of reference. Like, you're not, hey,
No.
I'm waiting for psychiatrists to say that I'm normal. No 16-year-old is waiting around for that. And so it's a very different social moment in our culture when a young person is exploring their experience of their sexuality. And that really is attesting to some of the differences in emergent language versus dominant language.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. 100%. I definitely see also what you're talking about with the reliance on the scientific understanding,
Mm-hmm.
the biological element for the civil rights movement within the LGBTQ community, because it was this way of saying, it was why I've seen so much in my history that there has been hesitation in the LGBTQ community of my generation and older to even engage with the social construct aspects of sexual identity, because it felt like it worked against this reality. But the thing I always try to point to in my work is like social construct or not. And again, it's not about the orientation. It's not about where the attractions come from, but these cultural aspects that we attach to it, regardless of where it comes from, it creates your experience. It like develops your experience. You're put into these understandings, and then now you're brought into it. And I think that's also been one interesting aspect of what you've been talking about here is like, I think for me, I'm speaking a little bit on a personal aspect, but then also from my work is I think for like queer people of my age and older, there was a realm of we were put into those categories. whether we liked it or not. Whether you were
Mhm.
bullied in school, whether you were, I mean, I get it even now. If I preach in my church and I never mention that I'm gay, I'm automatically put in that realm and I need to like address it. I was like, we'll talk about, this is something the audience has heard me talk about before. One of the tensions I live in is I don't want to be the gay pastor, but I am a pastor who's gay. But like the ways that it gets put on you because of the characteristics, because of mannerisms, because of language, because of these things. And it feels like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like it feels like there's a little bit more freedom for that within the youth. Like there might be some of this pressed upon by society, but it's a much more internal processing of language in my experience that is kind of occurring with these emerging identities.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah,
And I would keep in mind that just as residual is diminished
still
and it's
there.
not
Yeah.
very much influence in the culture and dominance the main thing.
Yes.
Emergent is not that influential yet. The question is
Yes.
whether emergent will become dominant. Like what's going to
Yes.
happen? When you do
Hmm.
Gallup surveys and you see 23% of younger people identifying as LGBTQ. So, okay, is that going to be sustained over time? Is that what is that like for those people in the next 5 years, the next 10 years? Is the way that they conceptualize themselves going to become dominant? Will it
Yeah.
kind of be more fringe? Like I think those are just, and I'm just genuinely curious
Yes.
about that as a researcher.
Yeah.
I don't have a real strong opinion about it. It just I find it to be kind of fascinating, really.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's a great point. It's not like this emerging sexual identities are the main thing. It's still very much
Yeah.
the dominant for a
Yeah.
reason. But I
Yeah.
guess that's as I was hearing it, it felt like there was this more freedom within that
I
realm
think
to
so.
be.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. I think
Okay.
I think in some ways, part of what when people study emerging sexual identities, they get the sense that younger people feel like the dominant categories are too restrictive, too regimentary, and just kind of like I can't find myself in them. I'm going to fall through the cracks. And so here's language that communicates my experience. And I think what Rob Cover brings up in his work is will these emergent like sexualities feel more rigid, or maybe they'll be equally rigid.
Yes.
Because one of the things he brings up is, you know, they're being navigated at a younger age. So it's one thing to sort of become aware of your sexuality and explore that at 15, 16, 17, and maybe come out at 17, 18, 19. It's another thing to be
Hmm.
online at 13 and 14 and in these kind of social digital media spaces to kind of be in a space where you're curating and exploring your sexuality in these micro minoritized ways. And will you feel pressure to be who you say you are in an online forum where anybody can
Yeah.
comment on, here you are saying you're pansexual or you're demisexual or you're aromantic. Okay, well, how do you demonstrate authenticity is what Rob Cover brings up. Not because he wants them to, but because
Hmm.
that has mattered to the gay community, that
Yeah.
you are who you say you are. Well, as that gets younger and younger, and these terms that are not well known by a lot of people are being layered in there for a younger person, what does authenticity mean at 14? And is
Yeah.
someone at that age prepared to demonstrate that? And what would that look like? So I think those are good questions that as a psychologist, I'd also want to ask, like, okay, I think that's worth asking. Does that create more anxiety for that 14-year-old? What if they walk that back? Is that okay? Because it's not
Hmm.
the innate, immutable conversation that the gay community had in the 1970s and 80s. And you know what I
Yes.
mean? It's a different conversation. So, people talk about it more like trying on clothing. Now,
Hmm.
is that sounds like great freedom. On the other hand, if it's scrutinized for authenticity, is it as free as it sounds? I think those are
Yeah.
just good questions that we don't have answers to yet.
Yeah, and I think that obviously there's so many different elements that play into this. First of all, the general idea within the dominant identities was always that if you weren't straight, you were gay. You did have bisexuality, and there was some fluidity in some of that realm of some people maybe processing whether they're bisexual or whether they're gay. And so some people, come out as bi and then later on come out as gay. And that created a lot of bi erasure kind of conversations about, is anyone even bisexual? But then I think there was always this pressure, especially because of the lack of cultural acceptance, that if you were going to come out as gay, you had to be you had to be very sure before you did it, because a lot was about to shift in your life. And so then there's a little bit more acceptance, but then there's more identities. There's more, there's more language to give to it. So then there's this fluidity. And I think that it's an interesting aspect of that within I guess part of for me has been understanding that it feels like identity we think of it as static, like you were talking about, especially for the queer community. It's meant to be this like static thing of, you got to be sure to know who you are. I'd say in general, and that is true, but in some ways our relationship even with our identities changes over time. That's kind of what I was explaining before. I remember when I first came out, I needed everyone to know I was gay. I needed everyone. The person in the supermarket, every single person needed to know I was gay. And then, but before that, I was really scared about it. And then now it's just like, it's settled into an, organic place in my life. It's a part of me, but it's not everything of me. But we don't often think of identity and our relationship to identity in that kind of formative, way and stuff. And I guess within this realm, because you mentioned social media and then also kind of this fluid experimental aspect, I know that there's always a lot. I'm kind of going to merge two of my questions for you into one a bit here. But I know parents are often concerned about the influence of social media on, their kids. And then also when we see that fluidity, when we see that experimentation, I think that often creates this moral panic that kids are making this up. So I guess in that sense, what do you see as the role of digital spaces? And then what are your findings related to the complexity behind what it looks like to shift identities in this label? You've already talked about it a little bit, but I'm also thinking from this parental or concerned mindset that says, oh, they're just being influenced or they're making this up kind of thing.
Yeah. Before I jump into that, I was thinking about there's an identity formation model. I mentioned Erik Erikson earlier. Okay. And so, that would just be the idea of identity formation. And then, people drew on that, like John Marcia and then Vivian Cass in particular, that was the first theorist and researcher who applied identity formation to the experiences of, at that time, homosexuals, but of the gay community. And it's there is exactly what you described yourself experiencing. You get to this place of identity pride where everything in the gay community is to be celebrated and people are to know it, and here's me at the checkout. And then it kind of swings back to balance. There's good and bad in the gay community, there's good and bad in the broader communities. And so you sort of find this synthesis of your identity. And so exactly what you described is kind of been worked out in theory in developmental models for gay people. And it'll be interesting to see where emerging sexual identities, do they map on to some kind of identity model that we could sort of understand, or is that, are we just going to be kind of lost in the sauce trying to figure out what that experience is like at 14? So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, then actually, before we get to my other question, because I sense that you had something to say here, because we'll go back to the parental one. I guess within this realm, because I like I said, I don't think a lot of us think of it that way. I get a lot of Christians who say, well, why do they have to make everything about their queer identity? I'm like, well, they've never gotten to do anything with their queer identity. So now it's just really important. And I always try to encourage parents and Christians to be like, give them time. They're just it's like a bomb. It's just like the dam just opened, and now you're just getting everything. And over time, the pressure will release, but you have to give them space. Yeah. Do you see anything common, either just generally common traits? I know you just talked a little bit about that, but are there traits or factors within that journey that you would describe as helpful or unhelpful often within that journey?
Well, one dynamic that I see is particularly in conventionally religious spaces. I'm an evangelical Christian, so in Christian spaces that are more conservative, there's such a shame and such a stigma attached to coming out in many circles. I think, in our research, this goes underground. At a young age, a person who's even aware of their sexuality realizes it's not okay to name that. It's not okay to say that. It's not okay to share that. So on average, they're coming out closer to when people either go to college or vocation training. So like closer to 18, 19. And that's a little bit delayed than what you might see in the broader society for people in this space. And it might be a reflection of the religious elements, not to pick on religion. I support, obviously, but the idea that we might be creating spaces in our churches that preclude young people from being able to name their experience or disclose it to anybody. So if you keep something under wraps for the next 4-5 years, then you go off to university and, parents are, it's Thanksgiving, their child's home for the first time. And it's like they come home and they plant, a pride flag on the turkey. And the parents are like, whoa, what happened? Is it college? Is it university? Well, it might be that they, for the first time, are able to name something. And so the pendulum definitely goes to the other side of a kind of celebratory, I see it more like resilience at that point than, like, I try to help people, okay, this is the pendulum's gonna come back to center. Give it time, like the way you described it earlier, I think would be really valuable. Don't be so reactive. And also, just from a consultant to churches, I would say, and also realize that we've been complicit in the very dynamics that made this possible. So when we react to the pride flag, we're reacting as though that happened in a vacuum of like willful disobedience when we were part of church communities that made it impossible for them to say, hey, this is part of my experience in middle school or high school, which could have been really helpful to have someone walk alongside them in this rather than, shove it down, hide it, keep it compartmentalized, and then you go off to college. And everything kind of blows up there. So
Yeah, because there also becomes a realm, because I've seen it before where even a person, I've experienced it. Your interests change, the way you express yourself changes, and within that, this can kind of like take us into a little bit of what we were talking about with the shifts and the social media aspect is you're seeing other people who identify the same way as you, and you're asking, is that me? Is that not me?
Yeah.
And maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. Like some gay people are really like expressive with their clothing, other are not, and they might try it. And so some of those kinds of ways that they then show up suddenly may feel very jarring compared to the person that you've known before this. And some of that might not last because they might try it and then they say, oh, that's actually not me. This is not actually. But if we can't give the space for that to be at least present for a moment, then we might even just shut down something that is actually really, through shame rather than anything else.
Yeah, as you know, there's so much heterogeneity within the gay community that it's not one. You can point to TV and media and say, here's a portrayal. Okay. Yeah. Well, we don't do the same thing to straight people and say, well, here's the straight person that everybody's like. There's so much variation. So I think not being reactive to that. So let me circle back then to the parent who's like who's wondering about this. I mean, I would be concerned about social digital media spaces for a lot of reasons. There's some good reason to think that affects our any young person, even as they get older. It's not usually time well spent. It's not usually time that enhances like education, correlates and achievement and things like that. So I think we should all be doing a little bit of a check on how much time are we spending on digital and social media, and how do the algorithms end up kind of curating our experience toward extremes. I think all of us run that risk. But it does feel a little bit different when you're in your 20s and 30s and 40s and older as an adult to be able to say, okay, I know about this, and we're still subject to it, but we can make the choice how much time to spend. But when you're 14 and you're 15, is that really going to be a good idea? So, and this is coming out of other lines of research that other psychologists do on just the impact of digital and social media. And so I would, like I think of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. Like there's some really good work being done, at least drawing our attention to how smartphones have affected people, how it's affected achievement in school and things like that. So I think, yes, we should be. But those are bigger things that affect everybody. So let's say your young person's navigating their sexuality in ways that are like non-normative. Okay, yeah, I could see there being concerns. But a lot of times young people are also turning to spaces that give them some sense of value or validation that they're not finding in other spaces. And so again, it's not that I commend that as much as I'm saying, realize how it functions for them. Like they may be turning to places to express something, to explore something, to name something. Like, how do different labels function for young people is a great question for someone in youth ministry or for a parent to ask. So rather than being so reactive to identity first language, be asking, is this language for them to explore something that's part of their experience? Probably. Is it because they're wondering if it's true for them? Maybe. Is it to give them a sense of agency and say in things they don't feel like they have much control in their life? Could be. Like there's possibly a dozen different reasons why someone might be exploring identity in a digital and social media. And not all of that do we need to be alarmed by it, right? I think to be a little bit more curious would be helpful. I think once we're sort of like, let's tamp all that down, let's make sure that it's not happening. It's not like it goes away. It just goes to other spaces for exploration. So it's something to be thoughtful about.
Yeah, 100%. You're talking to one of the biggest critics of social media. I hate it so much. And it's, we need to be safe about it, but that doesn't mean, again, coming at it with suspicion towards everything of our kids or what we learn. Like I actually would say one of the most beautiful things about social media is we see parts of the world and people that we've never gotten to see before, and it helps us understand and connect with, us in the midst of so much isolation, but it can also create a lot of division and just isolation as well. So there's totally there. So as we kind of move towards the end of this, I have some questions in the realm of, you've been in this, how long have you been doing this kind of work within sexuality and faith?
Well, I mean, I started in graduate school, but I graduated in 1998. And so I've been doing it professionally, like as my career since 98.
Okay. Well, I guess in the midst of all of this, and especially as you've been doing this work, what cultural shifts have most surprised you, I guess, in adolescence? How adolescents talk about sexuality and gender? Like you're even in this, you're like, I don't know where this is going. But as you've done this research, what has been the most surprising thing for you?
Well, it was a while back, I would say, maybe around 2012, 2013, when I was doing a lot of youth training on sexual orientation and identity and sort of reacting. How do you in middle school and high school respond to a young person who says that they're gay or navigating that space? And then I was getting, I remember it was like 2012, 2013, all of the Q&A turned to gender. And so it was all about transgender and non-binary. And I really, I'd always worked with people who experienced their gender differently than cisgender people do. Because a lot of parents thought maybe my child's gay, but they didn't know of the language transgender. Like it was just not part of the cultural discourse. So I think when that happened, that was probably the biggest surprise. Not that I was surprised that these experiences happened. I was seeing them all the time, but that they became so central in the cultural discourse. Like, I think it was Time Magazine had Laverne Cox on the cover, the transgender tipping point. Like, it was like, okay, wow, this has really become mainstream. And I think that surprised me, probably the biggest thing.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, obviously when you have, now this is also gender, but when you have what's called the Dutch model for responding to gender dysphoria in children and adolescents and the medically affirmative care movement. I think that surprised me because I didn't really know much about the Dutch model. It was developed in the 90s and it was brought to the US in like 2007. So it's a relatively new kind of an approach, and it's gotten super controversial. It's very polarized, and there's some states ban it outright in the U.S. Some countries in Europe are restricting it to just IRB controlled, studies. Others are fighting legislation to protect access to it. Like we're just locking horns over this. So that's been a surprise to see all of that develop in the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you. It was interesting that how it felt like there was this sudden shift from everything about gay marriage and gay marriage culturally, because that was like the main conversation. And then it was like the trans experience and trans identity and bathrooms and all of this stuff, just like this and how that connected to like kids and their parents and these kind of conversations then in that. So in that similar way, so like that's the surprise forward, like in the back. And what is an area of research or a practice around identity and sexuality that you think is underexplored or needs more attention in this area?
Well, I think an area that's emerging in the sexuality, gender conversation would be consensual non-monogamy.
Okay.
So that's it depends kind of where you are in the U.S. right now. Just where it's not like it's super common, but in some parts of the country it's more common, and so you're seeing more textbooks being written on that for the first time, and more of a like, okay, how is the field going to respond to that? How are faith communities going to respond to that? I mean, I think those are conversations are yet to happen.
100%. Yes, agreed. And I love that you guys talked about that in the book of like, wait, does this include in this? Does this not? Because it is becoming, you are hearing it very often, and it's not just, I think forever there's been individuals both, across sexual identities that have had open relationships, but maybe not so publicly or even as an identity in a sense.
Yeah, the identity piece is definitely newer. And I think that's going to be a question, like conceptually, how do people understand that? And what does that mean for legal right? Like all of those things are going to get opened up, I think. And it's going to be a harder conversation. I think even Christians are going to struggle with this because, when you talk about, is orientation in Scripture, is diverse gender identities in Scripture? Well, are open relationships, multiple spouses, concubines in Scripture? Well, they are. So I think that's going to be an area where, unless you're pretty sound in your doctrine, I think people are going to feel tripped up in those areas. And I don't think they should. I think as a Christian in that space, I don't in this conversation, I don't think those things should trip the church up. But we've been tripped up by a lot of things. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was a hard conversation.
Yeah. But I think it kind of goes back to what you were talking about at the beginning of like the church, even right now, is still processing the dominant identities. And then now it's like these emerging identities. And it's like there's more coming down the line to, that we need to be able to engage with and talk with and not. I think the sad part is it's like the fear that we have to even talk about it that then makes us like create this gap. And it's not about talking about it from even like an approving or a moralization, but it's just like engaging that this is the reality of the people we're trying to care and reach for, like care for and reach.
Yeah. And you brought up so in the book, we wrestled with this. Should we name this or should we not? And we decided to name it to make sure that people didn't conflate emerging sexualities with a different conversation, because there's a lot of people who are drawn to consensual non-monogamy who are not sexual minorities or gender diverse or so I didn't want to in some ways you could say, well, then don't include it because we don't want to confuse people, but we wanted to include it to say that's not the same thing. So just don't bring in your anxieties about consensual non-monogamy and apply them to this conversation. It's a different conversation.
Yes. Yeah. So as we wrap up, one of the things is I feel like a thread we've been talking about is the formation of identity and how a lot
Yeah.
of this is
Yeah.
walking with people in in this journey, young people or anyone. And so um, what can churches do, pastors do, maybe even like youth pastors more specifically, to better create the space needed from what we have now to like walk alongside people to in the process of identity formation through these kind of emerging identities or just in general?
Yeah, we provide a kind of a ministry model that would have to be tailored to your youth, the kids that you're caring for. But it would be we do it from kind of a narrative understanding. Narrative is like the story that's being written about young people, and I think that's
Yeah.
has a little bit of postmodern elements to it when you talk about story. But I think it works pretty well because in a sense, Christians would say God is writing a story as He's revealed Himself to us through the prophets, and as He's incarnate through Jesus, and what He's moving us towards in terms of a final destination, the consummation of all things. And so there's many elements of that work well. So I think of it from a ministry standpoint. We talk about it as like preface, like oftentimes people with emerging sexual identities feel different than their peers at a young age, and they are trying to make sense of that. And then they're making meaning of it. So that's kind of our second step in it. And then we move towards like meaning is like attributions. What do I make? How do I make sense of this? Am I an abomination? If that's the way my church talks about this space, I would say adamantly no. But if you were to say, should I think of this the way like Wesley Hill has a article he wrote about feeling like a thorn-pricked Christian, the way Paul talked about a thorn in his flesh. And so that's an attribution. That's a way of thinking about it. Should I celebrate it in the ways that the mainstream gay community does? Well, maybe not identical to that, but maybe in some ways recognize that this is a part of your experience to not feel like you have to hide and be ashamed of in a stigmatizing way. So there's like making meaning of it is a huge part of the narrative. And then so a ministry, youth minister person could sort of see themselves kind of coming alongside a young person, being more familiar with the story and competing stories that are going to be out there, stories from the church that are going to be very hard for someone to navigate, stories from the mainstream gay community, some of which may be reasonable and other things might be a bridge too far. Like, okay, well, help them. What is a kingdom-based story based on God's heart for them? Like, ultimately, you're asking a young person to trust that God is a good and loving Father who loves them, and His plan for them is better than the plans they're going to hear all around them, and even plans that the church has sometimes stated in ways that have been really, really harmful to young people. So
Yeah.
what is that story, and how does God reveal Himself to that young person, and how does a young person come to trust God as a father? And I think that happens because they're around people like this youth minister who are a good ambassador of the kingdom of God to them. And they see the possibility that God could be that father in their life because they're around people who love them the way God loves them. Like, I think those are some really good, helpful ministry takeaways.
I love that because I've been drawn in spiritual direction to the image that will often be used in Judaism to of Jacob wrestling the angel as the image of faith. Because I think often within one of the parts that we've struggled with in evangelical circles is the idea of how we think like if I just give you the Apostles' Creed understanding and like 2 + 2 = 4, then you're good, and I just tell you it and now you believe it. But what I'm hearing from you is it's like creating the space to walk alongside people in this wrestling, in this
Yeah,
struggling.
that's
And
right.
it's that trusting in the spirit that I'm not just going to tell you, hey, here's the things to believe, but like the spirit is the one leading, and we can be in that wrestling match with our youth, like
Yeah, and yeah.
be in this
Ask.
journey
Yep.
and this story work and hearing the story and going through that. And there's a trusting in that. I feel like we can often get a little bit nervous
Mm.
because it's like, well, where is this going to go? And that's where I think there's so much trusting in the Spirit that can come to be like, if we can trust in the Spirit and walk alongside these kids, we don't have to be in control. We can walk alongside. We can do the like story work that you're doing. So I love that a lot.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking this time with me. I
Oh, thank you,
appreciate
Josh.
it.
Thanks for asking me, and just really appreciate the questions you've asked and just your heart, obviously, for the community. So very, very grateful for
Well,
you.
I appreciate everything you're doing. I mean, like I am so jealous of you and Dr. Sadusky. How you all write? How much? I don't even know. But I really appreciate you and your
Yeah.
work and everything you're doing. It's a treasure and a blessing to
Mm.
myself and so many others. So, where can people learn like more about your work and these things? I mean, definitely everyone needs to pick up this book along with the Emerging Gender Identities.
Yeah, so I have a website for our institute. It's wheaton.edu/SGI for sexual gender identity. Um, and then I'm on Instagram, Dr. Yarhouse, and on X as well. So, yeah.
Okay, awesome, sweet. Yeah, everyone, y'all check it out. Check out Dr. Yarhouse's work. Check out these books. You will not be disappointed. And thank you so much, everyone. You can get more content from the Holy Ourselves podcast by going to patreon.com/Holy Ourselves. Also to the Substack. All of those will be in the show notes, and to holyourselves.org if you're interested in spiritual direction or cohorts and more. And just so thankful for this time. And I will talk to you all soon. Bye, everyone.